Excited to start off this morning with a good friend of mine. Glenn Murray is has a very interesting history in the course of his life. A bit of a Canadian vagabond, I would describe him. He was born in Montreal, has been the mayor of Winnipeg, currently resides in Toronto, and I first met him when he was environment minister for Ontario for the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change. He's held a number of portfolios in the party, and recently decided to exit politics and take over as executive director of the Pembina Institute. And for those of you who don't know, the Pembina Institute is the most prestigious energy and environmental forum in Canada. And one of their main objectives right now is to assist Canada on its transition to a clean energy economy, among other objectives. I can't think of a better person equipped to lead that charge, and it is my pleasure to introduce Glenn Murray.
Good morning. How are you? Caffeinated? Up, ready to go? Not too much partying last night? Craig, I just want to start by thanking you and Carr for the tremendous work you're doing. The first joint purchase of services between Quebec and Ontario is the offsets program. And it's probably one of the most complicated and difficult and frustrating files in government when a government does it on its own. When two governments do it, and this is the first time they've ever done joint procurement in the history of the country, it's rather remarkable. It was certainly frustrating for me as minister. I'm sure you've had your frustrations in dealing with that process, but I want to thank you and your team for what has been really outstanding work in that area, and we will continue the good fight to make sure this all comes out with a happy ending, as they say. So I just want to, I was sort of asked to talk a little sort of broadly about the future and a little bit about where things are at in Canada. But I want to spend a little bit of time sort of going back to basics in a way about what we're trying to do, because I think sometimes in all of the detail, the mission gets lost. And I don't, put up your hand if you sometimes find climate change overwhelming, depressing, and the solutions to actually get to where we need to get to go seem unfathomable and sometimes nearly impossible. Okay, so I'm not alone. Do we all feel better? Just knowing you're not alone is a good thing. So about a year ago, I was speaking in Zurich to about 100 CEOs of mostly major energy companies, and it was an interesting turning point, and probably one of the reasons I decided to leave politics. And not that I was upset or and I do miss it sometimes, because that ability to create change is, I think, what we're all trying to do, and politics can be a very effective way to do that. But I looked at the Paris agreements, and I started doing the math, and I said, well, how do you keep it under 1.5, which is really what we have to do? As a matter of fact, I had the privilege of chairing the National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy, which is the big research-intensive organization created by Prime Minister Mulroney years ago to coordinate environmental and economic research for the Prime Minister. And I chaired that, and it's a body of a series of CEOs, outstanding scientists, environmentalists, that assembles and does research. And you get really the best science briefings just about anyone in the world can get. And I chaired that from about 2004 to 2008 under a conservative and a liberal prime minister. And it was interesting back then about how little time we had to actually solve this problem. And then when I did the math, one of the things that we realized, and most people don't talk about, is that for ecological systems on the planet to recover, it's not staying under 400 parts per million. We actually have to be at 280 parts per million or less. And the science is fairly solid on that ecological restoration requires us to actually get back substantively to below where we are, which is rather daunting, but very possible, by the way. So I always have to see a solution to a problem. And I really have always believed, I'm an unrelenting optimist, that you actually have to have an accurate assessment of the problem to solve it. And I think part of the problem is that we're not having some serious conversations, because in some ways the problem's even bigger than we think, and we're already feeling overwhelmed. So what does a solution start to look like? Well, I think there's a few practical steps in that. One of them is we have to meet the Paris Agreement. So and some countries have retreated from some of their commitments, and many countries, including Canada, are struggling with how to meet what were somewhat weak commitments relative to the need of the problem. So if you can actually get people to start to decarbonize industry, decarbonize electricity, and do all the things that were committed, that's an absolute essential. But if we did everything in Paris, we still don't get there fast enough. You know, it's that we still have our Thelma and Louise moment. We are just slowed the rate at which we're hitting the cliff. We're still going over the cliff, and the point is, if you're going over the cliff, it doesn't really matter what speed you're going over the cliff. The whole point of this is to hit the brakes before you get to the precipice and the point of no return. So there's so I posed a question which I thought was quite interesting for me because I couldn't answer it. I said, well, what else would you have to do? And I thought, well, what are the big carbon sinks matter, the forests and the oceans. So ecological restoration would have to move up and become a part of that. And Canada, forests aren't even counted as part of our carbon balance sheet or making a contribution or detracting from our national ambitions. And they kind of have to be. The boreal forest and boreal region is 54% of Canada's surface area, and Canada is the second largest country geographically in the world. So that is under real stress. White and black spruce trees, which populate, are the majority of the population of trees in the forest, don't survive at 8 degrees Celsius warmer temperatures in winter, which is what we're heading for. So the efforts of NASA with the Arctic Boreal Vulnerability Experiment right now is really important data sources and some of the work being done by Dennis Murray. But I met a guy that named Stephen Runnels, and Stephen has a company called Permium Global, which is massively reinvesting in biological restoration of ecosystems in Borneo, in the Amazon rainforest, and in Nigeria with great success. He points out of the 5 billion hectares of forests on the planet, only 10% of them have complete intact canopy cover. And the work that he and his team of scientists, he's quite a wealthy guy. He was a venture capitalist, managed the funds of high net worth individuals, told me that Barclays Bank bought him out for way too much money and he became very rich. He still lives in a modest bungalow and has put all his money into that. So how do we as Canadians, and in California where we have 123 million dead trees in California, how do we look at that? And the point he makes is one of the biggest things that you could do quickly to start to restore the carbon balance is try to get intact canopy of our forests up to about 90%, which he thinks would take 30 to 40 years. So we'd have to start now. So it seems to me like one of the work that NASA's doing and Americans are leading in, and where American exceptionalism comes into play, is an ecological restoration of forests. So do everything in Paris, add ecological restoration of our oceans, our forests. That's got to be a top side of. The third thing that I think gives me hope about where we've got to go, and these all relate to carbon markets because it's all about producing the capital to do these things, and these are all things that are good business propositions, is the technologies that actually take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere is an area of which there are very few companies, a couple of hundred. They estimate that you need about 20,000, if you look at mathematicians tell you, to get the probabilities of success. But it seems like decarbonizing the atmosphere should be a huge priority for all of us around the world, but particularly in North America. We should try and have our Kennedy-like moment and say that within 10 years, we're going to advance the technology that can start decarbonizing, because that would make a huge contribution to it. As a matter of fact, that in itself might be. And that's not spraying stuff in the atmosphere or wild and crazy geothermal. This is simply decarbonizing and capturing carbon dioxide and dealing with the chemistry of that. I think the other work that Bernard David and people are doing at the Global Climate Initiative around carbon utilization is really, really hopeful. And I want to come back to that in a moment and talk a little bit about that. Because carbon, stop thinking about methane and carbon dioxide as pollutants, but as useful inputs into the economy is incredibly powerful. Our experience in Canada with carbon utilization has hugely been successful in cement and mining and forestry. Starting to think about this as an economic asset that can actually be repurposed and be used in the production of oil and gas and cement. That decarbonization process is really quite exciting. There are only 180 companies. There's a great report that Bernard and his team did. He lives here in San Francisco. It's rather remarkable. I sadly just had a heart attack. He's just on the mend now. But for Pembina, that partnership with Global Climate Initiative is one of our huge priorities. That's about a $1 trillion market in all of the areas, aggregates, cement, polymers, that they're working in, and fuels. Not only do you get about a 10 gigaton, you could reduce greenhouse gas emissions by about 10%, the profitability of all of those industries is huge. And we're seeing that application, and I'll tell you a couple of stories about some companies in Ontario have increased their profits while they're decarbonizing what are carbon-intensive industries. So, I mean, I think though, if we pursued all of those together, we get there. We could probably get there in 30 to 40 or 50 years. But it's an economic challenge. And I've always viewed, as much as we're into the carbon markets between Ontario, Quebec, and California, and I think there's a few things I've done in my life other than being a dad and a grandfather, probably the most important things, is this idea that what Ontario and California, Quebec have created, and hopefully joined by places like Oregon and Hawaii, you don't need a lot of players. You need a small number of big players. And I think that there's two tiers to this. We talked about it a little on the panel yesterday. There's the communications challenge, which means get as big a tent and as pluralistic a tent as you can to get everyone in the conversation. But if you want to protect fuel standards from Donald Trump and from folks like that, you only need a couple of powerful jurisdictions. And the two .CAs, Canada and California together, as long as Prime Minister Trudeau and Governor Brown and the provinces, Premier Wynne and Premier Couillard, stick to their guns on protecting that fuel standard, nothing the US administration does will change that. Simply the reality of a market that size, everyone's going to have to produce cars to that higher level. So I think we need to be very strategic, elections will come and go. We lost our friend Jay Weatherall, sadly, who was one of the greatest champions for climate action in the world out of South Australia. We will lose good people, sadly, through this process. But as with biology, diversity and density give you resilience. So we have to make sure that we always have a number of options and a number of partners to do that, and we all own that responsibility. I will tell you, someone in elected office, the strength of your ability to act, you can't have leadership without followership. And sometimes government have to follow brilliant business leaders. Elon Musk, for me, is a transformative figure in the world right now. He is incredibly consequential to the international conversation. But because it is economic, I think we have to, and I mentioned this yesterday, become a little bit more literate. We've had, since NAFTA was signed, probably the highest level of economic growth in the modern history, with the exception of the Second World War and the aftermath, really in the history of our economies. Our wealth is greater. I mean, it's not distributed as fairly as you might want it to be in our countries, and there's gaps. I mean, particularly in the United States, you're seeing quite stratification of income from higher, lower, and some real damage being done to the middle class. Great book by a woman named Saskia Sassen at Columbia University called Expulsions, which is one of the things I think is a must-read about the North American economy and why it's so unfair and how people are getting pushed out of it. But recognizing that, it has created an incredible amount of wealth, and it's given the powers for countries domestically to redistribute that wealth as governments are wont to do and able to do. But this year is the 30th anniversary of the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. Do you know who proposed that? Who was the biggest advocate for free trade in North America? I'll give you a hint. 1980 was the year. Reagan. Reagan proposed in his presidential bid in 1980 to have a Commonwealth economic union in North America like the European Union. And he delivered it. And that was the Canada-US one. 25 years ago, one of the Bushes, I guess the first one, proposed to bring Mexico into that. And that was signed 25. So this year right now is the 30th year of the anniversary of the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement and the 25th anniversary of the North American Free Trade Agreement. And I mentioned that another thing everyone should read is the Wharton School Peterson Institute study of the first 23 years of NAFTA on what it's actually done. And it actually points out the net gains for Mexico in manufacturing. How many manufacturing jobs do you think Mexico has gained? Millions? Because they're just stealing US jobs, right? Terrible. 400,000. Whether or not free trade was there, I mean, Mexico might be able to argue that it might have done better without NAFTA. But 400,000, 5 million US manufacturing jobs have been lost. The trade between the three countries has gone up 3%, 3 times, threefold increase, which is moderate, it's not huge. Our economies are very integrated, and we've massively reduced the cost of production. Everything imported into the US from Mexico is 40% made in the US to start with. It goes back and forth across the border. 25% in Canada, but you extract mostly resources from us, so you don't get the same US content because we are still selling you a lot of raw resources and a lot less manufactured goods than we would like to be. So we haven't exactly become a threat. And Boeing just kind of blew up Bombardier, so we haven't done too well on the protectionist front there either. But an automobile goes back and forth 7 times between Canada and the United States before it's produced. There's no such thing as a US or Canadian or Mexican cell phone. There's no such thing as a US, Canadian, or Mexican car. They are completely integrated. And so why is that important? Because from my perspective, what we're in is an economic transformation. And we're in an economic transformation on 2 fronts. One is we have to improve our productivity, and that's got to be driven by innovation. I was born in 1957, and in 1957, 2/3 of people worked in manufacturing. About 20% today in my country. That also was the year where we today use 8 times as much energy as we did in the year I was born. In the year I was born, we had televisions and suburbs and automobiles that were very fuel inefficient. We were a pretty intensive economy. Probably doubled the population since then, but not 8-fold. I graduated high school in 1975. We use 4 times as much energy today per person as we did when I was in high school. So energy efficiency per capita consumption is really if we want to be competitive, we have to start growing our economy with less oil and gas than ever before. We actually have to get back to almost any point in our modern history to get back to the level of energy efficiency we had when many of us were teenagers or born or in our 20s. And I don't think that's too hard to do. The other thing that's changing is, and why trade is so important, is that there are major industrial revolutions, and we are arguably in the third. In the first one, which was about steam and coal and iron, and we went to gas and electricity, that was really in that resettling of the global economy where the US really replaced the United Kingdom as the major industrial leader. And that happened after the First World War. And the First World War really made petroleum pervasive because the war effort and the deployment of all of that heavy equipment required gasoline. As a matter of fact, prior to the First World War, about 28% of vehicles in the US were electric. And that disappeared after that. And in 1926, which is sort of viewed as the first year which electricity and oil and gas were widely available as consumer products at a significant scale, was really the beginning, in some ways, of the great golden age of US exceptionalism and dominance. Because we went to we were on this new general technology platform. We are now moving to a new general technology platform of electricity and the internet and storage and renewables and a new set of a completely integrated economy of the internet of everything. And the next 5 or 10 years are not only important to decarbonization, they're also important to the settling of the new economy. Because since the recession, Ontario is a large 75% of Canada's heavy industry. We make more automobiles than we ever had in the history, but we do it with 200,000 less people. It's highly automated, it's robotics. There's 700,000 net new jobs in Ontario since the 2008 recession, and I'm giving you these numbers because I know them better, but I think this is true generally of most successful economies. 80% of them are in the private sector. 80% of them are above the medium wage. They're high-paid jobs. 80% of them require advanced education, and only about 15,000 of them are manufacturing jobs of that 700,000. The new economy isn't making things, it's a creative and design economy. They're designers, they're financiers, they're lawyers, they're people who work in creative and management spaces. It's the economy, as that BASF ad says, we don't make things, we make things better. And we're really in an advanced economy, and you see it here in California and Ontario and Quebec, and that the divide is between the people who are who have embraced this new general technology platform. The challenge is that to be successful in that, a company has to ensure that about 20% of its customers are domestic and 80% are beyond its borders. The companies that are growing and surviving economically are ones that are internationally trade-based. And part of the reason the US dominated the global economy for the last 100 years is because it embraced the new technology platform and it became the most aggressively market-driven economy in the world and the best trading economy in the world. And it is now retrenching from a Reagan view. And on the environmental side, it was Pete Wilson who founded the Cal EPA. It was Richard Nixon who founded your National Environmental Protection Agency. There was interesting to me that the people who were the free traders were often the biggest environmentalists. Brian Mulroney, who led free trade, who I voted for because my party in Canada, the Liberal Party, abandoned free trade for the first time in its history. So I went and campaigned for the Conservatives. He introduced higher sales taxes, cut income tax, introduced the National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy, and he aggressively pursued free trade with the US. And we lost the Campbell Soup Company and the Tupperware factories in our small towns. We restructured our economy. The branch plant economy disappeared, but we emerged on our real strength, and we became global players, and much of the prosperity of Canada and the ability of us to pay down our debt was from that. So why is that important right now? Because we have this challenge of living back where we have historically on a much more productive, efficient use of energy. We've got to detach economic growth from resource consumption, which is what the Germans are, 5-10-fold increase in resource consumption. And we have to massively trade internationally. We have to build global supply chains for massive transformation. We have to be producing the electric cars. We have to be producing the batteries. We have to produce the next generation of aircraft. We have to produce the knowledge centers to do that. A trade war right now with China would be a disaster. I mean, not for us in Canada, because the yuan is traded internationally only in Zurich and Toronto. The Chinese are finding strategic partners, much the way that the US partnership with Japan after the Second World War, after ending a war with a country, led to an incredible emergence of those two economies as two global leaders, is how do we actually take this on as an economic challenge? Because we invented markets. The United States almost invented capitalism. We know that cap and trade drives out the most efficient reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. We know that the proceeds from cap and trade, when properly spent, take care of the things in the economy, the infrastructure challenges that markets can't drive out. They deal with social equity issues. They decarbonize housing. If we cannot make the case for trade and for the power of markets, what are we going to do? On the right, politically across North America, trade and markets are under attack from the very party that invented much of the market-based instruments that we're using and discussing in this room. In Canada, Naomi Klein, who wrote a very brilliant book, is saying dismantling markets is the way to go. Please tell me what the substitute is. What's more efficient? And so we have to build a better carbon club, and we have to build, and by that I mean coalitions of business, environmental groups, labor groups, and governments that can actually seize these opportunities and explain them. And we have to understand that what we're facing, the decarbonization and energy efficient economy, is a global challenge, and it's going to be driven by business. The reason I left politics to go into the not-for-profit research institute quasi-private area is because the instruments of government are there to do that, and some of them are under attack. But really what this is the massive deployment of capital, technology, and talent. And we've done that. The irony of this for me, and I'll just give you one example of it in concluding that we can have a bit of a conversation, is the oil sands. Ironically, In 30 years, that was a whole bunch of bitumen locked up in sand. Billions of dollars of public sector money, billions of dollars of private sector money led to the largest deployment in the history of Canada of capital and talent and technology. The technology didn't exist to extract that. In 40 years, we went from having no oil and gas extraction of consequence in Alberta to Alberta having some of the largest oil and gas reserves in the world and having exploited them with an unprecedented level of public and private capital, mostly international capital, and a deployment of technology and the creation and training of a workforce in a couple of decades unprecedented. Unprecedented. And I always say to Albertans, be really proud of that, because the low carbon economy requires us to do that kind of thing. It requires the same preparation that went into the Second World War when we retooled our entire economy, when the dreams that built our national railways coast to coast. We have to ascribe to a transformational view of our economy, which we have done before, and we need to do again. And we can actually look to many of the traditional industries that are now the sources of our emissions to understand the level of ambition and transformation required. And I think we've got to stop talking in incremental terms and stop talking in transformational terms, and I should just stop talking. There we go. So the entire point of my conversation, what's going on in Canada right now is exciting. We're building the first electric gold mine in the world by a group of companies that said that cap and trade would destroy them. They found out that when you actually put electric vehicles underground, you don't need massive ventilation and you don't need much electricity, which means that a gold mine that's decarbonized operates at 20, 30, 40% less cost to extract gold than one that doesn't. Cement companies are putting carbon dioxide to make more resilient cement, using less energy to do it, getting a better product, getting a better return. One of the largest oil and gas refineries is putting $650 million NOVA to decarbonizing and to repurposing and utilizing carbon dioxide. Oil and gas, cement, mining, these were not the companies and industries you thought would lead the decarbonization revolution. They were supposed to be the recalcitrant, difficult ones. They're actually leading the transformation, and it's the background price on carbon that's doing that. But they're already at a level of ambition beyond most governments. So I guess what I'd like to try and talk to you about is how do we get to this higher level of ambition? How do we get to our moonshot? I mean, how do we get back to learning the experiences of the last 50 years where Canadians and Americans and Mexicans particularly were pretty genius at doing ambitious things? And why is our discussion around transformation to a low-carbon economy lacking that ambition in so many ways? And so I'll start with asking you that question, and you can ignore that question, or you can ask me a question or share a view, because you have a few minutes, right? Anyone someone has a mic around here. Anyone got a question? Or did I put you to sleep this morning?
Thank you, Max. Thank you, Glenn. That was a characteristically excellent talk. Thank you. One of the challenges is, right, demand and consumption. Okay. The finance that we need is available, but financial system is just the plumbing. It takes excess capital from one place and puts it in another place where it's going to get a return. If people aren't buying those goods, you know, they don't put their money in ethical pensions or, you know, low carbon, you know, products, the money won't flow to it. And politicians like votes, right? And if people aren't voting for action on climate, politicians won't take action on climate. So how do we get the, you know, Joe voter and the person that is spending their dollars and cents to spend it more wisely and to vote for these policies? Because that's what's needed.
Okay, I'm going to say something that's might be surprising. Don't talk about climate change. You don't need to. What? Electric motors for Loblaws? So for the big retailers and distribution logistics companies in Canada, they all looked at what happens if they bought Tesla trucks, which they are. Loblaws was they bought the first 25, our biggest retailer. China now has an incredible range of electric vehicle products and heavy equipment. The mining equipment that Goldcorp bought for its Ontario mine are huge trucks. They're massive trucks. But they buy those because having a fleet of electric vehicles with good range, which they now have, reduces their mechanics costs. Internal combustion engines, especially diesel engines, are very expensive to maintain, very labor intensive to maintain. Fossil fuels are expensive and messy and risky. Cooling, heating systems on those trucks are expensive. You do it at a fraction of the cost. Why is Lafarge Cement decarbonizing? Because they're good corporate citizens, yes. But they're doing it because they can sell that cement for more money and it costs them a lot less to make it. Goldcorp is building an electric mine. Why? Because electric mines are sexy or they have a fetish for it? No, because they can actually, when they electrify a mine, it's a fraction of the cost to extract those resources. So I think we should unapologetically be making the business case. So one of the things I like about Pembina is I work with a whole team of very brilliant young engineers, economists and planners, people with MBAs. And what we try to do, we spend a lot of time, we're doing some work with George Marshall talking about this. In Alberta, we talk about the dividends of a new energy economy. We don't even talk about climate change there. When we're talking about buildings in BC, we talk about climate change because that has a lot of currency in British Columbia. But we also talk about the fact of what we often call forever buildings. You build the durable building envelope and you have modular energy and storage systems. You're building a building that is a better value proposition, basically is indestructible, could last forever, and is a more efficient, better investment that pays a higher return. I mean, one of the things I really profoundly believe in is if there was no such thing as climate change, almost everything we're doing in buildings, transportation, industry is the right decision to do, even if there wasn't climate change. Because every single cement company, if you can start getting carbon dioxide and methane as an input into the economy rather than storing it or throwing it out and treating it as a waste economy, this whole idea of really moving to what I think accurately is described as a circular economy is simply a massively better future with higher paying jobs, better investment. We have extracted enough aluminum in Ontario and Quebec. We could run our entire aluminum smelters on recovered aluminum. You don't mine bauxite in Jamaica, you don't extract alum, you don't have a global carbon-intensive supply chain, and you probably produce aluminum, I think, at about 20, 25, 15% of the energy with no new virgin materials cost. You know how inexpensive aluminum becomes, which we use in aircraft, appliances, car chassis, fuselages, beverage containers? You know what that does to the Ontario or Quebec economy when you actually you reprocess aluminum? And if you've already taken enough stuff out of the ground and you don't need to go back to the expensive, energy-intensive, messy, dirty idea of resource extraction, we have 3 steel mills in Ontario that run 100% on recovered steel because the auto sector produces so much abandoned vehicles. That's a supply chain that is much more efficient and less expensive than going to virgin materials. So imagine that we commit as Canadians and Americans and Mexicans, because we have an integrated economy, we have the scale and the capital and the banking to do that, to be the first truly circular economy in the world. The productivity gains would blow China out of the water and blow Europe out of the water. And why aren't we being as proudly pro-market, pro-trade that we've actually got the better value proposition for the future? You know, the problems that we have politically are from a lack of imagination and a lack of leadership. Why is rural Canada, rural Ontario so red, to use your colors? Well, 3 generations ago, 1 out of 2 people in Canada worked in agriculture. Today it's 2 in 100. Agriculture has gone from being the most labor-intensive part of our economy to the least labor-intensive, which means when 1 out of 2 people worked there, you mean you had a big rural population. You don't have a big rural population or a big rural economy because only 2% of people work in food and agriculture. The same thing is happening with manufacturing. But are we less successful? No, we now are producing a whole new generation of jobs in the same way that manufacturing replaced agriculture. This new creative economy is replacing that. We have to be visionary, we have to be honest, and we have to figure out a way to redistribute those jobs back to those communities, because the internet does allow for more democratic, equitable redistribution. But where is the business and political leadership beyond a handful of people, most of them in this room? I'm not shaming you guys, I think we're all on the same team. We have to actually make the powerful argument. And our failure to do so is letting people who are born of ignorance and false news and trying to restore coal, these bankrupt ideas are dominating a news cycle because we're being too quiet. So, and we are not. I mean, we may be accused of being overly polite in Canada. One of the things we love about Americans is that you are so out there in front of the world. And I think we need you out in front of the world again. Yeah. Sorry, I was just waiting for someone to talk. I can fill in the dead space easily.
Well, it'll be my turn. Hi, nice seeing you again. And I totally agree with you. I think we are at a time where we can reimagine what our economy looks like. And my question to you is, the negative externalities of our current economic system that's based on extraction has impacted communities, particularly communities of color, much more negatively. What do we need to do in order to transition to a clean energy economy that's regenerative and addresses the issues of those communities who haven't had a chance to thrive economically from the current economic system? Transitioning to a clean energy economy that still keeps those communities where they're at, I think won't ultimately have that transformational impact that you're describing.
Right. Well, I mean, I think there's an interesting alignment, and I hope the Republicans rediscover. I mean, everyone who calls themselves a Reagan Republican makes me laugh. Can I just answer the question quickly? It's interesting because you're getting into a whole bunch of social policy, right, and electoral policy. In Canada, when I run for office, I can only spend 25 cents per voter. I can only raise $80,000. Money plays no role in Canadian politics, and now corporations and unions can't donate to political parties in Canada. That's a huge difference between Canada and the United States. Money plays no role in Canadian politics. As a matter of fact, it's hard to raise money. There might be some lessons for the U.S. in financial reform. Citizens set boundaries for electoral ridings, not politicians, so they're all done on natural boundaries, and that might be some lessons that we might be able to teach. The education system is very large, very good, very free. Your first university and college degree in Ontario, most places, is free. Massive immigration. We are a country, my constituency in Toronto when I was an MPP got about 50,000 refugees and immigrants in the downtown area in Toronto. They're all going to school, and you hear Urdu and Hindi and Chinese alongside English and Italian. I think one of the great things in Canada, because we're trying to build the most multicultural, most diverse, racially diverse, religiously diverse country in the world is part of our mission. That changes things. That creates social equity. There's less a sense of a difference. We believe in Indigenous treating 7 generations, all of our relations, Indigenous culture, it's a cultural crisis, all of those kinds of things. And then there's trade, create wealth. I mean, the one thing that the way you make money, you make more money if you sell something. If we sell something in California, that makes more money. If we sell something to each other in Ontario, we create less wealth. Canada is the largest customer for 38 of the 50 states. California is one of our largest customers. One of the things that we're trying to explore in the Ontario-Quebec-California partnership is how does Ontario and Quebec, using a cap and trade market, become a better customer for Tesla, for California technologies? How does California become a better customer for Canadian technologies? And I want to say that's got to be centered in all of that, because that creates the wealth that if you have good social policies, which you have with progressive governments, that gets redistributed. But you got to create the wealth, and trade is a way to create the wealth. And this is all about trading new technologies. This is all about greening supply chains. This is all about making sure that California, Quebec, Ontario, and all of our US and Canadian and Mexican friends have these global companies. Let's build these global new technology companies. Let's not surrender this next resettling of the global economy. Let's not have it all settle in China. Let's actually have a globally fair, distributed economy, and that isn't in trade wars. That's through innovation, imagination, courage, and making borders thinner, not making them thicker. Thank you very much.